Hello, Jacob.
Thank you.
Hi, Amy.
Hello?
His global is still good, but the home number, I'll get here. Yeah, anyway. Can you text it to you, or you put it in your phone from my text? I'll text it to you, you press. the-
Hi, Abe.
Is your number the 213 or the 310?
I'm 310-462-9809.
Okay, the other one must be Susie's. Okay, you should get it.
Jorge.
Buenas noches.
No, eso es dos veces seguidas. Wow.
¿Viste? Hoy no estoy cuidando nietos.
Es verdad.
Esa es la diferencia.
Sí.
25?
No, I don't think we're that far. Are we
Yeah,
on 211?
No, 225.
We made it all the way there?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, we learned Igris Moishe that said you could have a shalosh shudis, that's why the shtiblach, that's why they eat there. Okay. So we're lectures and conferences in the synagogue. Thank you.
Where's the bowl fries?
1 second. No, okay. Susie left it out for us.
Oh. What would you do without her, Ernie? Be lost in the desert somewhere, right? You want some?
Yeah, I'll have some. Harold,
Yeah,
I've been
Yeah.
watching a fantastic documentary
on what?
on the life of Bill Russell.
Oh, yeah, I saw it on Netflix. Is it good?
Yeah, it's very good.
Oh, good.
You should see the archival films they have about him and Chamberlain.
Oh, with the little shorts, the short shorts.
No, but just like you're talking
Oh,
about
the
19,
battles they had.
you're
Yeah.
talking about 59, 1960.
Wow.
It's done very well.
Is he still alive or did he pass away?
He passed away this year.
Oh,
Yeah, he died.
He passed away. He was 88.
88. He owes me $10.
He's an interesting comparison of living healthy versus unhealthy between Wilt and
Right.
Russell.
Wilt was 62 when he died.
Yep.
Wow.
He did not live a healthy life.
Well, that's what I'm sharing.
Right. Right.
The difference
was-
between,
Yeah. He was promiscuous. I think he smoked. I think he lived, he worked out a lot though. He would always play beach volleyball.
Yeah,
You would see him playing beach volleyball in Santa Monica Beach.
just to pick up girls, not for exercise.
exercise of a different kind.
Yes.
All right.
Okay. So lectures and conferences in the synagogue. We studied some of the basic sources concerning proper conduct in a shul, including understanding its source and eating and drinking inside. In this year, we will examine some interesting and important applications, such as organizing other events in the Beit HaKnesset, and some of the world's rules concerning the mechitza. So we saw in the previous shiur that some activities are forbidden to be performed in synagogue, even after it's no longer in use as a synagogue. The Shulchan Aruch, in the continuation of the passage quoted in source 27, mentions additional activities that are forbidden. It says in Kuf Nun Aleph, Sif Kot Yud Aleph, Vafilu b'churbano, even after a shul has been destroyed, you cannot use a shul a tashmish meguneh, kegon zriya v'cheshbon shel rabim lamani tno. You're going to plant there, public accounting. These are dvarim biz yoynos. The Shulchan Aruch makes reference to this activity elsewhere, where it's considered that some types of accounting would be permitted, namely those related to the performance of a mitzvah. You can't do calculations in a shul. Let's say you're going to make a collection for redemption of a prisoner or tzedakah. So you can do that. The Bir Halacha, the Mishnah Berurah, elaborates upon the prohibition against accounting in the shul. Let's say there's a board, a community board, that's called the Shmonei Tuvei Ha'ir. That means the Jewish communities used to be run by, let's say, by committee. And they would vote. I mean, they had somewhat of a democracy. And they would gather and they'd keep minutes. And there's probably some kind of accounting function they did to keep track of how much funds the shul, the community had. And if they had no other place to gather, they could not, they still couldn't gather in the shul because it's not covered. Even cheshbonos of the rabbim you shouldn't do there. Of course you shouldn't do private cheshbonos. The implication is that it is not permitted to gather in a Beis Knesset for meetings meant for budgeting and the like, which do not constitute Torah learning or tefillah. Nevertheless, in the Tzurba Shiur, Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg writes that he found grounds for leniency in Nazi Germany to hold lectures about topics other than Torah in the synagogue. He suggests that if the matter is conducted properly, it would be permitted to use a synagogue for these administrative functions, especially in situations of great need, when there's no possibility to gather together anywhere else because of persecutions or other circumstances. So the Tzurba Shiur writes the following tshuva. By the way, the Tzurba Shiur died in 1966. After the war, he lived in Switzerland. And he was one of the Gedolei Ador, one of the poskim that many important shilas were addressed to. He wrote a famous shilah about bas mitzvah, that because of psychological reasons, you could do some kind of celebration for bas mitzvah, and many other important tshuvas. Professor Mark Shapiro wrote a biography about the Street. That was really his first famous work. And in it, he describes that there was a fight over his coffin when they buried him in Israel. The Mizrahi held of the Sridei Eish as their posek, but the more Haredi community they felt he was a gadol because he learned in Slobodka, and anyway, so he was buried, with the Litvish Gedolim. So he describes that kind of battle that occurred when they buried the Sridei Eish. So he really was accepted by all sides. He introduces the tshuva that he wrote that tshuva. He got this question during the time of the Nazi. Yimach Shemam. Bisman shayudim ba'Ashkenaz v'artzos hasmuchos, the Jews in Germany and in the adjoining countries, he's probably referring to Austria, Poland, right? Hayikvushim b'dei Russia, ha'meturaf ha'manuva yimach shmo v'zichro. They were under the thumb of that evil man. V'kulam hayanusinim lemirmas tachas ragli mishartzav ha'roitzchim v'torfim. And everybody had to be under the boot of the Nazi soldiers. Ben shar gzeres hayumos, among the edicts, decrees, the bad decrees, German Jews were not allowed to gather in public places, except they could congregate in shul. So, milvada erech hahistori, yesh l'tshuva zu gam to'eles iyunit alach l'maisa. He says, besides this being a matter of historical interest, that 500 years from now people will read about this period of time where there were these decrees against Jews, he says there's a halach l'maisa issue. Other communities of Jews that have been scattered in the four corners, shemachmas nesibot shonot, for different reasons, ein lachenu bnei Yisrael afsharut shel kinus hamonim milvad b'bate knesios of bate midrash. They can't gather publicly, safely, except in a shul. So he says, like, for what purposes? Lashmiar tzos b'tapek neses mutar. Mitzad, let's say lectures. He says technically is permitted. V'yet v'yoser tov. He says it's better. Kodim hartzo yomru eze psukim b'tehilim oezet dvar Torah. Somebody should start out with either Tehillim or Dvar Torah. Muvan me'elav shemutar rak ladam shemulza kirei shamayim avlo b'chafsi b'dei oisa. Only a God-fearing person should give a lecture, not some free-thinking person. She'efshar lachshash lo yidaber divrei minus. He's going to talk apikursis in the shul. V'lachein ein lahatir l'shum ish below reshus harav moed asra lidrosh b'beis hakneses. The Rav of the shul, he's the one who should give permission, whether a certain lecture should be given or not. Then he says, "Ein lahatir tavikuchim achar tzos mishum oifen." You should not allow debate. Where a lecture is given and then there's a debate about the subject. That's not bekovadik. The muvat she'efshar lachshosh shebein hamitvakim yi anashim chofshim. First of all, he's concerned that there's going to be fry mention, people that are not shomer Torah mitzvahs part of the debating. Choshashani gami kalas roish. He's concerned about frivolity. She'asur b'beis hakneses b'chol oifen. Ve'avikuchim, he says debates, hema pi rov b'hista arut. People are boisterous, they do personal attacks, or jokes, v'gormim l'schok, v'hitul she'asur basically, all these things are behaviors that are forbidden in a shul. Lasos concertim chiloniyim, like a secular concert, that's Osir Mikol Ofen. V'ala Rav Mutalim Sor Nafshal Zeh, even if the rabbi is going to lose his livelihood, he shouldn't allow a secular concert. Koncertim Datiim, if it's a religious concert, like, Mordechai ben David. This rabbis also are not happy with that. If it's a source of controversy, maybe you can rely on this. That maybe you should be lenient. He says absolutely not, men and women should sit together. That he brings the Gemara that says, in the base of Mikdash, the women were on the inside, the men were on the outside. It led to frivolity. They created the mechitza, the women above, the men on the bottom. The women should stay in the women's section. Or he says, at least the men should sit with the men and the women should sit with the women. Let's say you without a mechitza. He matters this in a shul only because of this period of the Nazim. Should Shasat Chaki Yadua. Mirtz Hashem Kasher Yachid Hashem Gulenu. Hashem will take us out of this and give us better borders. Nashuv Vezras Hashem Yos Zehirim B'Kedushas Beit HaKnesses B'Chol HaChomer. The poskim discussed another possible basis for leniency. By the way, just a footnote. Rav Weinberg seems to hold that a mechitza, or at least separate seating, is required in the shul, even during events other than tefillah. Rav Moshe Feinstein, on the other hand, ruled in a number of tshuvas that this is not required for events that do not involve matters of sanctity. The subject of having a mechitza in the synagogue we'll discuss later in this year. The poskim discuss another possible basis for leniency in a situation in which allowing a lecture in the synagogue would prevent people from hearing a comparable lecture outside the synagogue under objectional terms. This is brought by the Piskei Tshuva. Some write that the rabbi and posek have the option to permit someone to lecture on a mundane topic, such as health or livelihood, in the Beis HaKnesses, if by doing so, the congregation will refrain from attending comparable lectures from people who will speak in a manner inconsistent with the spirit of the Torah. That means they're not going to be dressed properly, not sneas. So, and would be proper for them to open the gathering with a chapter of Tehillim or a brief Torah address. If the shul contains a social hall, auditorium, or some other room appropriate for such an event other than the sanctuary, that would certainly be preferable. So here's the Piskei Tshuvos. Yesh hakosim sheyesh b'efshos l'rav v'moirat tzedek l'asei seter la'artzos Beis HaKnesses. There are those who say that the posek can allow lectures in the shul or the Beis HaMedrash. Hartzor shel divrei chol binyonei parnasa, how to make a better living, obrius. Somebody wants to talk about a medical topic. Otherwise, the people are going to go listen to somebody who's not shomer Torah mitzvahs and not beruach haTorah. But nachon sheyiftechu akinus beperk tehillim be'ezar Torah tzara. He also says they should start with Tillim. The Yalkut Yosef allows women to gather for appropriate purposes in the men's section of the shul. He says, he starts off by saying you shouldn't do general lectures, or concerts. Unless the lecture is going to provide some chizuk for learning or mitzvahs. You go on arichat seminarim, lekar v'choikim, latzur machtzavtam, like kiruv outreach. Umuta limsor shir l'noshim v'esak neses, the oifen shekovim shal l'noshim v'en sham anoshim. You can use the full sanctuary where the men sit, but the women can sit there as long as there's no men there. It is clear from I'm reading a footnote. It's clear from the Sridei Eish that he allowed men and women to hold a joint event in the shul as well, and certainly for a shiur, provided they sit separately. Rav Yitzchak Yosef is more stringent, does not allow men and women to sit together in the sanctuary for a shiur, even with separate seating. Using the synagogue as a shortcut. In the previous shiur, we saw that according to the Mishnah, it's forbidden to use the synagogue as a shortcut. Masechta Megillah Chav Tes Amud Aleph. Ein oisin also kapandria. You can't use a shul as a shortcut. My kapandria, Amar Rava. Kapandria kishma, like its name. What do you mean? My kishma. Kamandomer. Ad mekifna adri iyolba. That means instead of going around the entire row of houses, which is makif nadari, to get to the other side, ayolba, I'll go in this way to get to the other side. Meaning, it's making a shortcut. So, as the Mishnah notes, a person may not use the space of the synagogue as a shortcut. Even after the shul is a ruin, even after it's fallen in disrepair. And the Shulchan Aruch accepts the Gemara. The shul has two entrances. Don't go in one way and go out the other door. If there was a path here, and it passed through this area even before the shul was built, then you could. Let's say he didn't go in there for a shortcut. Mutter lasso is derech. So he can use it. When you enter into a shul to daven, it's permitted for one who enters to exit from another entrance. According to the Shulchan Aruch, the prohibition of using the synagogue as a shortcut does not apply if a person enters for purpose of using the synagogue, such as for tefillah. In that case, his choice of exit is not regarded as a shortcut. The Bir Halacha explains that it is considered passing through only if a person moves uninterrupted to the synagogue. But if he remains in the synagogue or learns Torah there for a moment, that can avoid it. Like we talked about it, like some people at the Sha'ar Tefillah, where there's a Beis Medrash, on the way out to the parking lot, some people sit in the chair or they stop for a minute to say a pasuk, so it shouldn't be a kapandria. You should read a pasuk or stay there for a few seconds. The Piskei Tshuva observes that a number of poskim dispute this leniency of simply reciting a pasuk or sitting for a moment. Thus, he writes that a person should be lenient only when there's no alternative. Maybe the Piskei Tshuva is going to say that we shouldn't use that shul to go in, but maybe you have to walk around to go in the front door. Some people disagree with this. Let's say you can use this if you're entering the shul to call your friend out. No. So this is going into, using that base measure going to shul is not what this is. You're not supposed to use it for a shortcut if you're trying to go, let's say, from one street to another, and you're using the shul as a shortcut. Then using the pasuk is not a teretz for that. To shorten the route, ain't heter afil by miras pasuk. Kol shekain, if he does it all the time, They had to Yeshia Ma'at V'Miras Pasuk L'Nemer Ela Ba'Ois Ba'Kroi. This saying a pasuk is only if it happens temporarily. The Lo B'Derech Kviyas. V'im Ein Afsharut L'Agia L'Makom Mesuyam. If you can't get to a certain place, Elek Sho'over Derech Beis HaKnesses, Yesh Mokam L'Akel. Then Ayidei Shia K'tzas Ramiras Pasuk U'V'Frat Im Holach L'Dvar Mitzvah. If you're going to daven into another shul and you want to walk through a Beis Medrash, you can do that. Ein Nichnas L'Beis HaKnesses Beis HaMedrash El L'Tzorach Mitzvah. So first of all, when you go into a shul, it should be L'Tzorach Mitzvah. K'gon Tefillah or Torah. V'Mtzorach Likra L'Adam Shenim Tzavei. You're going to try to, you need to call a person to come outside. Ikonis V'Yikra is a pasuk. You should go in and read a pasuk. Or Sheyomer Dvar Halacha. Or Sheyishma Dvar Halacha. Or Yishem Ma'ad Beis HaKnesses. You have to stay in the shul a little bit. And then you call the friend out. It's pouring rain. You're not supposed to lechatchila walk into the shul to get out of the rain. He was studying Torah outside. There's a courtyard that the shul has, and it's outdoors. A person learning there, and now it starts raining. Mutter. You should also wipe your shoes from the mud. You make the carpet dirty or the floor dirty. You shouldn't have dirt on any of your garments when you come into shul. It's a bizoyon. What about touring ancient synagogues? Many of us have been on trips where you go and you visit old shuls. So the fascinating question arises, based upon the halachot that we discussed here, and pertains to touring ancient shuls. Is it permitted to enter locations merely to sightsee and tour rather than to pray or study? So there are two different types of cases which we can distinguish. The first is of ancient synagogues that are in ruins. Many of these are found in Eretz Yisrael, can be visited when traveling around the country. The second is a synagogue that is not destroyed, but is no longer in use, other than as a museum or a tourist site. This type of case is more relevant to certain synagogues in Europe, such as the Prague Shul, where it may not be used for minyanim, but rather functions as a tourist site. We will focus more on the first case and address the second case briefly at the end of this section. Our first inclination would be that since a synagogue retains kedusha, even when it is in disrepair or in ruins, it should be forbidden to enter them for mundane purposes. As discussed previously, one may not enter a shul in order to use it as a shortcut. That presumably should apply here. Furthermore, it would seem that the prohibition of ein metailin means sort of taking a spazier, taking a walk, should also be relevant. The phrase was translated in the previous shiur as not loitering. And Rabbeinu Yonatan Miluniel suggests that the term may include touring a shul to admire its beauty. Metailin l'sachek b'soichan means to go and play inside. You want your heart to expand because of the beauty. Thus, it might be that an archaeological or historical tour of the shul would be permitted only if it involves some tefillah or Torah content. It may be possible to permit participating in such a tour, according to the Ramban, as well as the Rashba and the Ritva, who holds that although a shul in disrepair and ruins retains its kedusha, that kedusha is terminated after the community decides to sell it. Yesh layashiv v'lomed Beis HaKnesses also some ketashmishay mitzvah. They made a shul like items that you use a mitzvah with, lulav the sukkah. The hein atzman And even though even though you can throw them away at some point, bisman mitzvah yesh ben kedusha shel kavod. During the time of the mitzvah, the 8 days of Sukkot, when you shake the lulav, so you have to treat the lulav with great kavod, or the sukkah. Later on, after the zman mitzvah, it's a different thing. Uperish advorm the nois sukkah certain b'shas mitzvasim mishum dechal shem shamayim alein. So the decorations of the sukkah are usher to touch on sukkah because there's a shem shamayim on it. The fichach beis hakneses kol zman shebnei ir roitzin boy. If the community wants the shul to remain, umitzvasin alav, and it's still being used for a mitzvah, then, even though the shul is a state of disrepair, it has kedusha. Sharei adan lo over zman mitzvaso. Time of its mitzvah is not passed. Roy l'shapitz tzolvana. You could remodel it, rebuild it. Aval, but if the community of nimlachu l'melachru kvar, they decided to sell it over zman mitzvaso. Its time of its mitzvah is past, kasukah, lachar shiva, like a sukkah after the days of sukkahs. V'nifka kedusha of the mitzvah, mine, says the Ramban. Its kedusha has left. Vein sovik the mechir zu amur beis hakneses b'chol makom eine el b'sheish l'en beis hakneses acheres. Selling a shul only works if you already have another shul. You can't sell a shul if you have another shul ready to go. Lo lister inish. It says in Bava Basra, you can't destroy one shul ad the bani beiknish unless you built your new shul. So hilkach mechiraso vade muteresi. So you can sell a shul. It's like a sukkah or a lulav after the zman of the mitzvah. So according to Ramban, the kedusha of a beis hakneses is equivalent to the kedusha of tashmishei mitzvah, regarding which their sanctity is void after the time of their mitzvah. Accordingly, because the synagogue in ruins may still be rebuilt, it retains kedusha, even after it has fallen to disrepair. But if the constituency is not interested in rehabilitating the synagogue, its kedusha is void. And this may apply in the case of a tourist site synagogue as well, even if it was never formally sold, because it's not owned by anyone who plans to use it for tefillah. So the Zman mitzvah has passed. So that's how they're trying to learn here. Now, the Ramban's position is difficult to reconcile with the ruling of the Mishnah that a synagogue retains its sanctity because of the pasuk, "I will bring desolation to your sanctuaries," which is interpreted to mean that the sanctity of such places remain, even if they are desolate. They're still called, Mishkan, even by Churbanah. Rav Shmuel Rabinovich, chief rabbi of the Western Wall and the holy places, suggested the following interpretation of the Ramban's position. In the case of Tashmishei Mitzvah, their sanctity is a function only of their use fulfilling their designated mitzvahs. Thus, as soon as the time for the mitzvah is passed, their sanctity is likewise lost. By contrast, synagogues are unique in that their sanctity remains in place even when they are in ruins, because there's a mitzvah to rebuild them. For this reason, the Mishnah states that their kedusha is retained even when they are desolate. This parallels the kedusha of the location of the Beis Hamikdash, which stems from the determination that it will be speedily rebuilt. Unlike, for example, the sites of the Mishkan at Shiloh and Nov, which will not be rebuilt. However, the Ramban holds that if it is clear that a particular synagogue will not be rebuilt, such when it was decided to sell it, its kedusha is lost. According to the Ramban, then, touring an ancient synagogue ruin should be permitted, since they will likely not be rebuilt and used again as actual synagogues. However, the Ran dismisses the Ramban's interpretation and holds that the Kedusha's Beis Hakneses does not elapse. As we saw above, this is the position of the Shulchan Aruch. Another possible direction for leniency may involve the possibility that such synagogues were destroyed by non-Jews. in such a case, some achronim write that we may be lenient on the basis of the pasuk, and I shall turn my face away from them, and they will profane my secret place, and wild men will enter it and profane it. And he quotes the Abia Omer and the Shevet HaLevi and the Igros Moshe, who mentioned this issue. Still, it is uncertain if many ruins of ancient synagogues in Eretz Yisrael were actively destroyed by Gentiles, or they were simply abandoned over the course of the exiles, destroyed by the effects of time, in which case this leniency of having it be destroyed by non-Jews may not apply. It's also important to note that aside from the strictly halachic arguments mentioned, such places should certainly be treated with respect. In a similar context regarding expanding a synagogue and transforming the sanctuary into a courtyard, which would also be used as an outhouse, the Chassam Sofer observes that using a former sanctuary in this manner may be a kachil Hashem. Other nations readily honor a once consecrated place of worship. So if they do it, Allah has come we should do it. That even by the strict letter law, maybe you can make this courtyard. Even by the non-Jews, they keep a place that was used for worship as sort of a holy place. They fence it off, that people shouldn't go there. So the Chassam Sofer lived in Preshburg. So he must have seen a place of non-Jews where they fenced off a place because it had been used for tefillah. I previously have said, the reason we build a shul, to gather the public and to sanctify God's name there. Nafkilon mikra, we learn from the pasuk v'nigdashti b'soch bnei Yisrael. You should sanctify me, says Hashem, amongst Klal Yisrael. V'alfinon zeh shav toch toch deboy asar kemavur. The whole ibadlu mitocha edo hazos. The way we learn 10 people for a minyan is because it says, I'm separate from these 10 men. And he called it Toch. Megillah, V'nei Reisha Da'ikra, V'lo Sechalu Hashem Kodshi V'nigdashti B'zoch Israel. Not only is there a positive mitzvah of sanctifying Hashem's name, making a Kiddush Hashem, there's a love of Lo Sechalu. V'ashtan, Mevin B'Sek Neses, Yichilu Hashem Beinu Masolim V'oibrim, that when we build a courtyard out of a shul, and there's a difference between the way the goyim do it and we do it. We're going to be over Aresh Krov Lo Schalalu. Ech Yiskayim Al Zeh Sefer V'dash B'Yisrech V'Naver Mitzvah. Yes, says the Chassam Sofer, I know you want to be Mekadosh Shem Shemayim, but if through that you're going to end up being Mechalel, then there's an Aveira. Ve'ein Aveira mitzvah. Rav Ravinovich concludes that the practical halacha is that there is a basis for a lenient approach to this issue. Although lechatchila is best to be strict when visiting ancient synagogues, to treat them with the proper kedusha. This is a letter from Rav Shmuel Rabinovich to the Tzurba M'Rabanan. In limchos biyad noagim likonis b'teknos acharevim. He said you don't have to protest people walking into a old ancient synagogue that's in ruins. Even if they don't recite a Mishnah or Apostle. As long as they need to behave with covet there. you should treat the shul with all the kedusha that a built shul is. Okay, Roy b'midasev shul yishtav latziv b'tzeknesos charivim shalektim. You should put up signs in these ancient shuls that warn people to treat the shul in great covet. The considerations for leniency given above apply to actual synagogue rooms. The second type of synagogue tours takes place in shuls that are entirely intact and are used mainly as museums. Those of you who've been to Florence, for example, the beautiful there's a domed shul in Florence that's, or the shul in Rome. The shul in Rome might be used, but I don't think the shul in Florence is used. Rav Aaron Epstein, who lived in Prague in 1933, addresses this question and rules definitively that it is permitted based upon the heter sitting for a moment in shul and reciting a pasuk or just spending some time there. For a person to go into a shul, loli spalo v'lulamed, not to learn or daven, rak liros b'noam zivador beis hakneses v'akelim, to see the beautiful shul and the beautiful vessels there. He says, in my modest opinion, I don't think there's a prohibition. Because of our Rambam, the Perek Yudaf Mihilchos Tefillah, she'asur l'kadosh beis hakneses el dvar mitzvah. Even though the Rambam wrote you shouldn't go into shul except for a mitzvah. Mikol makom, alo because of a Rambam sham, the misha tzarich l'kadosh beis hakneses because tinek or chaver. If you have to go into a shul to call a friend, ikones. But v'yikramat, you just have to read a pasuk. Or yisha beis hakneses, or you sit in the shul for a second. She'ashiva sham yiskei mitzvah si. It's like you're doing a mitzvah there. Shneimar ashvei yoshvei beisecha. Ad kan lashon Rambam. By the way, that's the pasuk I use when I sit in shul for a minute. I use the Ashrei pasuk because of Ashrei yoshvei. Harei dafilu kisheikar kavanosu b'knisos lebeis hakneses likros lechaver muter. So even though he's permitted to go into a shul to call his friend when he spends a few minutes there, dashia batzma mitzvah, there's a little bit of a mitzvah. Ayin bebach veleo rabba, the lav dafki yeshiva l'shiyat, not even sitting, just delaying there. If you're going to go into shul to look at its beauty, we saw above that some limit this heter to cases where no other option exists, such as where you have to call another person out. It seems that Rav Epstein understands this heter to be operative in any case in which one wishes to enter the shul, and certainly when one wishes to admire its beauty. What about a mechitza? One of the most prominent issues related to the halachos of Beis Hakneses surrounds separation between men and women. Is this separation strictly obligated? And if so, what is its source? What are the halachic parameters, including physical dimensions, other quality of the separation? Is this a function of the physical space of the Beit HaKnesset or the tefillah specifically? These questions have been discussed extensively in the last century by contemporary poskim. And we will briefly summarize some of the issues' most important sources and opinions. It is unclear why the requirement of a mefchitz in the synagogue is not discussed directly in the Gemara or in the codes. Perhaps women did not attend services on a regular basis, or perhaps women were in the habit of attending only where there was a separate balcony or gallery. Accordingly, the matter was not a matter of controversy in the earlier times. According to contemporary poskim, the source for the requirement for mechitza in a shul comes from the Gemara in Sukkah Nun Aleph. The Gemara states that a separation was constructed in the Beis Hamikdash for the Simchas Pesach Shoeva, the water libation ceremony, to separate between men and women. So b'motzei Yontif, the Gemara says they built a big tikkun gadol. Amar Lezer ko Eser Shinich, Chelka Haisa B'Rishoina, the walls were smooth, the kifu exustra, and they put a protrusion connected to it. And they made the exustra as a balcony, and they made the women sit upstairs, and the men sat below. Women would be at the inside of the Ezra Snoshim, and the men were on the outside. So there was too much, mixing between the sexes. So they made the women on the outside, the men on the inside. No difference. So then they sent the women upstairs. We mentioned at the beginning of this year that the notion of Kedushas Beis HaKnesses stems from the mitzvah of Mora Migdash, reverence for the temple. Accordingly, the poskim, such as Rav Moshe Feinstein, infer that the requirement of Mechitza comes from the requirement to have a separation between men and women in the base of Mikdash, which the Gemara derived from Psukim. Says the Igrish Moshe, Minei etzem adin, she'afim ha'anoshim em mitzad echad, v'anoshim mitzad acher, asur nein lios below mechitza. That, let's say you were in one room, and men were on one side, and women were on the other side, you can't daven below mechitza. Hulani is daiti doraisa. He wants to say that it's a doraisa dika law. V'raya misuka. The proof is from this Gemara we learned. Shikshik Gemara zustra. Sha'asu be'ezras noshim. They said this balcony that they made to place the women upstairs. V'anoshim amata. Aksiv akol b'ksav. It says in Divrei Yomim, everything was written. That you have to keep the same architectural plans and not change it. So they found a pasuk to explain why men and women have to be separated. Rav Soloveitchik understands the matter differently. He holds that the obligation for a mechitza is rabbinic, but sitting in mixed company violates a different prohibition. First, their footnote. A third possible approach is that the requirement for inserting mechitza is based upon universal custom, which also has powerful halachic status. And this approach is taken by Rav Chaim David Regensburg, formerly Rosh Yeshiva of Skokie, in his essay, The Mechitza's Minig, where he writes that the mechitza should be classified as a custom designed to be a preventative measure that was observed by the people that has the status of halacha. Let's see what Rav Soloveitchik says in Nefesh HaRav. This is Rav Hershel Schechter writing about his Rebbe, Rav Soloveitchik. He was macher kol kach b'votek nesiyos shebem yoshim anoshim betaruvis. He didn't want men and women sitting together in shuls. He published in newspapers, you should not go into a mixed shul. You shouldn't walk into a conservative shul if men and women were sitting intermingled without a mechitza. If that was the only shul that was blowing a shofar, you should stay out of it. He says that the practice that the whole family, the men and women pray together, is all based on avodah zarah. So if you're going to perform mitzvahs in this way, He wants to say that men and women sing together in a shul violates avodah zarah, or it's an isser about doing things like they do it. Herschel Schechter says this is how Rav Soloveitchik explained it to them in the Shiurim. Says Rav Soloveitchik in an open letter, there is certainly a requirement for the erection of a partition. However, there's a basic difference between this wrong and that of the complete mingling of the sexes. For as I indicated above, separation has its origin in the Bible itself, whereas the requirement of a mechitza must be attributed to a rabbinic ordinance. The source for separation in the Tanakh referred to is the verse in Zechariah, quoted in the continuation to the Gemara in Sukkah, which discusses men and women standing separately during a eulogy. Rav Soloveitchik refers to Dvorim, which refers to Erva in a more general sense. Back to the text, the latter has been introduced in accordance with the old maxim, make a fence around the law as a safety measure in order to prevent the mingling of the sexes. What is the reason for the need to have a mechitza in the Beis HaMikdash and in the shul? In light of the aforementioned Gemara, the Rambam and the Mishnah Torah suggests that the mechitza prevented intermingling between men and women at the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. Ezra Sanoshim Ha'Samu Kefes Gezustra had a balcony, so the women could see, so they wouldn't be mixed. In the Perishah Mishnayos of the Rambam, he explains that by setting aside the balcony for women, men were prevented from gazing at the women. This approach indicates that the concern surrounds histaklus, gazing. Two separate locations. The women should be high, so that the men shouldn't look at the women. Rambam was a doctor. He knew about people's tendencies. So based upon these different explanations, contemporary poskim prescribe assorted dimensions for the required height of mechitza. Many poskim, including the Tzurba Rebbe and Rav Menashe Klein, argue that the mechitza must be tall enough to prevent the men from seeing the women. The position of the Tzurba Rebbe can be found in his collections of response to Divrei Yoel. Others who share this opinion include the Maram Sheikh and the Minchas Yitzchak. Says the Mishnah Halachos, which is the Menashe Klein, near the Kavanata Rambam, if he had a problem with the Rambam, he said if the reason for the mechitza was just so men and women should not mingle, it would have been fine for them to be on the same floor, men here, women there, and put like in our shuls, and put a mechitza between lavdil, vayna mechitza shel yud tfachim, have it be 10 tfachim or pachos mizeh, shezeh mani le'irbuv. You wouldn't need 10 tfachim, is not very high. But if the Rambam's problem was just intermingling, that would have been enough to keep them separate. He wouldn't have required building a balcony above. It was a purpose not to see. So based on that, a mechitza, if we were both on the same floor, would have to be high enough that you couldn't see them, not just 10 tefach. Now, Rav Moshe argues that the mechitza need only reach shoulder height, since this is sufficient to prevent mingling between the genders. He says it's meritorious to install a taller mechitza. He calculates the required height is 18 tefachim, which is 60 inches, 5 feet. Says the Igros Moshe, Lachein tzarech loymar she'isur rak mishum kalas roish, frivolity. Mistaber lani is daiti shesag mechitza gvara akar's fine. He says up into shoulder height. He says we see that the mitzvah is not because of istaklus. Oh, you'd be able to see their heads. If it's only 5 feet, he says this won't lead to frivolity, to intermingling. He says the poskim that are machmir, or the Jews that are machmir having even higher, should be blessed. Many shuls follow one of these approaches. It should be noted that though there are some more lenient approaches as well that have been followed in case of great necessity. Rav Soloveitchik is reported to have ruled that in case of great need, one can allow machitz of 10 tefachim alone. In a letter by Rav Moshe written to Mr. Baruch Litvin, not Litwin, Litvin, published in the Sanctity of the Synagogue, Rav Moshe recommends that the mechitza be at least 65 inches tall, though in a series of responses published later, he consistently mentioned 60 inches. And Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, the Sridei Eish, supported Rav Moshe's view as well. He also argues that in contemporary times, it's important that women be made to feel comfortable in shul, and mechitza that is too high will not achieve this goal. The Sridei Eish was amazing because he took into account psychological feeling. He's the one that wrote the tshuva about bas mitzvah, that for psychological self-esteem, a girl is going to not feel as good. So the shul, they rely on this Sridei Eish, why it became more noyeg to do bas mitzvahs. So he says the height of his standard halachic wall is 50 inches. Rav Soloveitchik opinions reported to Rav Aryeh Frimer, women in Minyan. So, okay, Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, who was the posek in America before Rav Moshe, is also reported to have ruled in this manner in case of pressing need. Sikvurus Eliyahu, it should be noted though that if a mechitza of 10 tefachim is accepted, one could also argue that a standard halachic mechitza may be required in shul as well. This would mean that a curtain alone, which is not a halachic mechitza since it's not fastened tightly to the ground, is insufficient as a mechitza in shul, even though it prevents mingling and the ability to see women. And that's the opinion of Rav Yehuda Henkin. Other than the difference of height, another practical difference between the opinions would be concerning a glass mechitza. According to Rav Moshe's approach, and Rav Henkin in case of need, a glass mechitza is acceptable, while the Mishnah Halachos would disqualify it, regardless of his height, since man can still see the women. Another difference may relate to the use of a balcony. A balcony alone should suffice according to Rav Moshe, since men and women are entirely separate from each other. But according to more stringent opinions, a mechitza would still be necessary to block the ability of the men to view the women. Poskim also discuss whether a mechitza or separate sitting is necessary only in shul and only during tefillah, or for other communal events as well involving men and women, such as wedding or shiurim. And that's beyond the scope of this, but we will deal with it later on in Even HaEzer when we deal with other halachos of women. Okay, I'm going to leave the halach of the halachic status of the Ezra Shnoshim to next week, but we will primarily learn the halachos of daily Torah study. Are there any comments, questions, discussion?
I find it interesting that they're concerned about the men looking at the women, never about the women looking at the men.
Well, Harold, we don't have any erva issues, meaning we do if we're not dressed properly. But there's more, I think there's more isurim. I'll say two things. For example, if a married woman has uncovered hair, so that's an erva. Or if they're not dressed properly. So if it's according to this certain sheet, if the elbow is an erva, okay, now a woman looking at a man, if a man is wearing very short shorts, that would be erva too. But in general, they were more worried about the man's Yetzer Hara than the woman's Yetzer Hara. I think a man has a strong, but you want to make an argument not so, right?
I just know that certain mechitzas, the women can easily see into the men's section, whereas the men cannot see into the women's section.
Right.
It's designed that way because I think the women feel restricted if they can't.
See what's
Obviously, they
going
want
on,
to hear, but they just want to see what's going on. Right.
right?
Yeah.
I can tell you, my wife
Yeah.
absolutely wants to see, at Yavna, they have the ability to sit downstairs.
Right.
Russia. And that was a great thing because they could actually, when they're up in the,
Right.
so they have no idea what's going on.
Yeah. Okay. Very good.
Uncle Yaakov, I think, wanted to say something. We don't hear you, Uncle Yaakov.
Thank you.
Jacob, we don't hear you properly. I think he's wearing a.
No, Rabbi, that's a shul. They remodeled it.
No.
Hello?
Jacob,
Oh,
Jacob,
Okay.
what did you want to say? We didn't hear you. Uncle Yaakov, did you want to say something?
Thank you.
Huh?
Hello?
I can
Jacob.
tell.
yeah, George. Hi.
Hello?
Yes, Jacob, did you want to say something?
Hello? No,
Jacob, did
I'm
you
in
want
a-
to say something?
it doesn't work. Oh, I know why.
Now we
I
can
saw
hear
the
you.
other day.
Now we can hear you.
Bernie's house is Hancock Park. It's the very bad reception there.
Okay, bye, everybody. We'll have a good week. We'll
There
see
was
you next
something else
Bye.
about the sound.